I am a father, 68 years old, a widower, a man who thought that after a lifetime of sacrifice, of pouring everything into the home I built with my own two hands, I could finally rest in dignity. I believed that my daughter, the child I raised through nights of fever and mornings of hunger, would one day stand by my side, not against me. But a week ago, in the middle of my own living room, she looked me in the eyes and said words I will never forget. "This is our house now. You either pay rent or get out." Those words weren't shouted by a stranger. They weren't spat at me by a neighbor, an enemy, or some ruthless landlord. They came from the lips of the very person who once clung to my finger as a little girl, the one who used to beg me to tell her one more bedtime story before drifting to sleep. My daughter. My only child. And as if that wasn't enough, her husband stood behind her, smug smile stretching across his face, a spreadsheet of expenses in his hand, as though he were presenting some airtight legal contract. Rent, utilities, maintenance, a breakdown of costs as if I were just some tenant overstaying my welcome in their precious property. Can you imagine the sting of that? Can you picture standing in your own kitchen, where you and your late wife spent decades cooking, laughing, sometimes arguing, but always returning to each other, and hearing your child declare that you no longer belong there? I felt my knees weaken not from age, but from the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. For a moment I thought I had misheard. I even chuckled nervously, thinking it must have been some twisted joke. But then my daughter's face hardened, her jaw set like stone, and I realized there was no punchline coming. This was real. She meant it. "You don't contribute, Dad. You just linger," she said, her voice sharper than any knife. Linger. As if my very existence was an inconvenience, as if the years of paying mortgages, of fixing leaky roofs, of pulling double shifts just to keep this house standing, meant nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as silence filled the room. I wanted to shout to remind her of everything I had given up, so she could go to college, so she could have the kind of wedding she dreamed of, so she could walk through life without knowing the taste of hunger that I swallowed for decades. But my throat closed. The words refused to come out. Instead, I stood there the same way a soldier might stand after being shot in the chest, stunned that the bullet came from his own comrade. And I ask you now, what would you do if your own child turned to you and said you no longer had a place in the home you built with sweat and blood? Would you fight? Would you cry? Or would you, like me, simply stand frozen in the storm of betrayal, unsure if your heart could bear another beat? For years I had feared the silence of an empty house after my wife passed. I thought nothing could be lonelier than those nights when her side of the bed stayed cold. But in that moment, I realized there was something far worse than loneliness. It was standing in a room full of family and feeling like an unwanted guest. My daughter's husband cleared his throat, stepping forward with that damn spreadsheet again, tapping the paper with a pen as if to hammer the numbers into my skull. "It's not personal, Frank," he said casually. "It's just practical. You're retired, and we're carrying all the weight here. It's only fair you start paying your share." Fair. That word nearly broke me. Was it fair when I worked 60 hours a week to keep food on the table so that his wife could go to piano lessons? Was it fair when I took loans to pay for her education loans I only recently finished paying off? Was it fair when I walked her down the aisle and handed her to this man trusting he would protect her, not turn her against me? I stared at him, at the arrogance plastered across his face, and something inside me shifted. I couldn't name it yet, but it was the spark of a decision, the seed of a plan. Still in that moment, I kept silent. My daughter mistook my silence for surrender. She crossed her arms, satisfied, and said, "We'll give you until the end of the month to decide. Either you contribute or you move out." Then they walked away, leaving me standing there among the ghosts of my memories, the walls echoing with the laughter of a family that no longer existed. My legs trembled as I sat down at the kitchen table. The wood felt cold beneath my hands, so different from the warmth I remembered when my wife and I had built it together. I thought about the nights I tucked my daughter into bed, promising her she would always have a safe home. And now, here she was tearing that very promise apart. But I didn't cry, not then. I simply stared at the floor, my mind racing, my pulse steadying. Because deep down beneath the layers of hurt and disbelief, a single truth rose to the surface. They thought they held all the cards. They thought the house was already theirs. But they had forgotten one very important thing. The deed was still mine. and I would not let my dignity be ripped away so easily. Not by them, not by anyone. So I ask you again, what would you have done? If you were me, would you have walked away quietly, or would you have stood your ground, even if it meant standing alone? Comment 1 if you know what choice you would make. Before I tell you how it all came to this, you need to understand what this house truly meant to me. It wasn't just wood and nails. It wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was the beating heart of my life, the place where every joy and every sorrow was carved into the grain of the floors and painted into the cracks of the walls. I built it with my own 2 hands back when I was younger and stronger when my wife was still alive, and we dreamed of raising our family in a place that would last longer than we ever could. We started with almost nothing, just a small patch of land I bought with borrowed money, a foundation dug on weekends, and a dream we carried like a torch through the darkness of poverty. I remember hauling bricks in the dead of winter, my hands raw and bleeding, while my wife brought me soup in an old metal pot, steam rising into the cold air as she smiled and told me it would all be worth it. She was right. It was worth it. Every corner of that house was built not only with labor, but with love. The kitchen where she taught our daughter to bake cookies, the garden out back where she planted roses that climbed the fence, the living room where we placed a second-hand piano and listened to our daughter practice until her fingers ached. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that made it enough. For years, the house was alive with sound birthday candles being blown out the slam of the screen door as our daughter ran to catch the school bus, the late-night whispers between me and my wife as we planned how to stretch every dollar. There were arguments too, of course, but even those had a kind of warmth because they were real, because they belonged to us. And I remember the promise my wife made me on her last night in that house. She was sick, far too sick, and we both knew her time was almost up. She gripped my hand and whispered, "Promise me this, Frank. Promise me you'll keep this house, no matter what. It's our legacy. It's where our daughter will always know she belongs." I promised her. I promised through tears, through the sound of her fading breath, through the unbearable silence that followed when she was gone. I promised, and for years I kept that promise with everything in me. That's why what happened with my daughter cut so deep. Because for the longest time, I believed she felt the same. I believed she understood what this house represented, what it cost, not just in money, but in sacrifice. When she was little, she would run into my arms after school, and I would lift her up so she could touch the rafters I had nailed in place myself. "Daddy, you're so strong," she would giggle. "You built me a castle." And I would laugh because to her, this place really was a castle, safe, unshakable, protected by the love of 2 parents who adored her. As she grew older, the castle changed, but it was still hers. I painted her bedroom walls in her favorite color, changed the light fixtures when she begged for something more grown up, and even built her a small study nook so she could prepare for college entrance exams. When she received her acceptance letter, I remember she hugged me so tightly and said, "I'll never forget what you've done for me, Dad. I'll always take care of you. Always." Those words became a lifeline for me, something I clung to. When the nights grew quiet after my wife's passing, I replayed them in my head every time I felt the weight of loneliness pressing down, reminding myself that at least I still had my daughter. At least she understood. That was the memory I carried with me when I walked her down the aisle. Her hand trembled in mine, her veil fluttered in the summer breeze, and I thought, this is the moment I pass her from my care into his. I trusted him. I wanted to trust him. And when he looked me in the eye and said he would protect her, cherish her, and honor her family, I believed him. I didn't know then what kind of man he truly was, how quickly he would see me not as family, but as an obstacle. The years after she married were not easy, but I told myself the distance was normal. She had her own life, now her own responsibilities. She came back sometimes bringing him along, and though I noticed the way he always looked around the house, as if calculating its value, I ignored it. I convinced myself it was harmless, that maybe he was just curious. I told myself I was imagining things, because I wanted so badly to believe my daughter's promise that she would always take care of me, that she would always see this house as more than just property. I wanted to believe that when the time came, this place would be our shared legacy, something she would protect as fiercely as her mother once did. And so, I held on to that belief even as small cracks began to form, even as her visits grew shorter and her tone a little colder. I brushed it aside, told myself she was stressed, busy, distracted. I clung to the memory of the little girl who once called this house a castle, who once clung to my finger with absolute trust. That memory was my shield, but what I didn't know was that while I was holding on to the past, she was letting go of it piece by piece, until one day there was nothing left but calculation and entitlement. That is why, when she finally looked me in the eyes and claimed the house as hers, it felt like the floor beneath me crumbled. Because she wasn't just taking a house. She was taking the promise I made to her mother, the trust I had placed in her, the decades of sacrifice that turned this place into more than wood and stone. She was taking everything, and in that moment I realized I might lose not only my home, but my very dignity. And so, I ask you, do you believe memories, no matter how beautiful, are strong enough to protect you from betrayal? Or do they blind you, make you see the person you love as they were not as they have become? Comment. Yes, if you've ever held onto a memory that later betrayed you. Looking back now, I realize the betrayal did not happen overnight. The signs were there small at first, like hairline cracks in a wall you think is still strong, until the whole thing collapses. I ignored them because I didn't want to see the truth. Maybe you've done the same, looked the other way, because the alternative was too painful to admit. The first sign came when they moved in. At first it was temporary, or at least that's what they told me. Just until we get on our feet, Dad, my daughter said, her hand brushing mine, her eyes still filled with the warmth I remembered. How could I say no? This was her home too, I told myself. If she needed shelter, if she needed help, who was I to refuse her? I welcomed them in, believing it would only be for a short time. But weeks became months, and months stretched into years. Slowly things began to shift. Furniture I had chosen with my wife disappeared. A chair here, a lamp there, until I would walk into a room and feel like a guest in a place that no longer looked like mine. They replaced the photographs on the walls, not all at once, but subtly, steadily. Where once there had been pictures of my wife holding our daughter as a baby, there were now smiling portraits of them on vacations I had never been invited to. My house was turning into their house, and I kept telling myself it was fine, that these were just decorations, nothing more. But it wasn't just the walls that were changing. It was the way they spoke to me. At first it was polite but distant small corrections here and there. Dad, don't sit there. We've rearranged the living room. Frank, could you not leave your tools in the garage? We need the space. Frank. They started calling me Frank more often than Dad. The first time my son-in-law did it, I let it slide. But when my daughter picked up the habit, something inside me twisted. A father is not a roommate. A father is not some man who happens to share a roof. But I swallowed my pride, telling myself it was just a phase. The second sign was financial. My pension checks, once enough to cover my modest expenses, began to disappear more quickly. I would find bills already paid before I even saw them, with little notes left on the counter. We covered this one, Dad. You can get the next. At first I thought it was kindness, but then the next never seemed to come. Instead, there were conversations about rising costs, about how everyone has to pitch in. My son-in-law began leaving spreadsheets on the dining table, casual at first like suggestions. Columns of numbers, percentages, highlighted cells, utilities, groceries, maintenance, always followed by his quiet reminder. It's only fair. Fair. That word again. The word that cut deeper each time he used it. Because I knew deep down, he wasn't asking. He was setting the stage. My daughter echoed his words, her tone gentle but firm. Dad, you're retired now. You don't have much to worry about. We're carrying the load here. Carrying the load, I wanted to scream. Did she forget who carried the load when she was too young to even know what the word meant? Did she forget who broke his back to keep food on the table, who skipped meals so she wouldn't go hungry? But instead of shouting, I bit my tongue, because I loved her, because I couldn't bear the thought of losing her completely. The third sign was the one I could never shake from my memory. They moved me out of my bedroom, my wife's and mine, the room where we whispered our dreams, where she took her last breath, where I had promised her I would protect this home. One evening, my daughter said, Dad, it's better for you to move into the smaller room downstairs. We need the space upstairs. The space upstairs. For them. For their new plans. I stood in that empty room after they moved my things, staring at the indent in the carpet where our bed used to stand. The air smelled different, foreign. It wasn't mine anymore. I slept in that cramped room downstairs, listening to their footsteps above me, and for the first time, I felt like a tenant in my own house. And still, I said nothing. I told myself this was temporary, that families go through hard times, that my silence was the price of peace. But deep inside, the unease grew louder. The laughter I heard from the upstairs bedroom felt like mockery. The constant rearranging of the house felt like erasure. I knew something was wrong, but I clung to the hope that love would outweigh greed, that my daughter would remember who I was, what this house meant. I kept quiet. I kept hoping. But hope, I learned, is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. It blinds you to the truth until the truth shatters you. So, I ask you, if you saw the cracks forming, would you have spoken up? Or would you like me have turned away, convincing yourself it was just a phase? Comment 8. If you've ever ignored the first signs of betrayal because the truth was too heavy to face. The night I discovered the truth, it wasn't because they told me. It was because they slipped up, because greed makes people careless. I had gone into the garage to find a hammer, an old one with a wooden handle that still bore the grooves of my hand after decades of use. While I was rummaging through the shelves, I heard voices upstairs. I don't know what it was about the tone, but something made me pause. I leaned against the wall, listening. My son-in-law was speaking first, his voice low but firm. The appraiser said we could get at least $400,000 if we list it this year. Maybe more if the market keeps climbing. My chest tightened. An appraiser, list it. I froze, unable to breathe, every muscle straining to catch each word. Then came my daughter's voice, soft, hesitant, but complicit all the same. But the deed, it's still in Dad's name. Still in Dad's name, my name. For a moment I thought maybe she was defending me. Maybe she was the voice of reason holding him back. But then he chuckled, that smug little laugh that always set my teeth on edge. Don't worry about that. We'll convince him to sign. He's old. He doesn't even read half the papers we put in front of him. We'll tell him it's just a refinancing or some maintenance document. By the time he realizes, it'll be too late. I felt the hammer slipping from my hand, the wood digging into my palm as my knuckles turned white. They weren't just pressuring me to contribute. They weren't just trying to nudge me into the background. They were plotting to steal everything. Everything my wife and I built, everything we sacrificed, for everything I promised to protect. I staggered back, heart pounding, a wave of heat rushing to my face. My daughter's voice followed, quiet but devastating. He trusts me. He'll sign if I ask him to. That was the knife. That was the twist of the blade that cut deeper than anything before. She knew. She admitted it. She was willing to use my love, my trust, my blind devotion to her as a weapon against me. And in that moment, the daughter I once knew, the little girl who called this place a castle, vanished. In her place stood someone else, someone who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle. I pressed myself against the cold cement wall of the garage, forcing myself to breathe quietly. I felt like an intruder in my own home, eavesdropping on a conspiracy that targeted me. My mind reeled. Should I storm upstairs, confront them right then and there, shout until the walls shook with my fury? Or should I keep silent, bide my time, gather proof before they struck? My wife's voice came back to me, the whisper from that hospital bed, all those years ago. Promise me you'll keep this house. And in that whisper, I heard my answer. I couldn't risk a reckless confrontation. If I exploded too soon, they might cover their tracks, twist the story, convince even the courts that I was a senile old man imagining betrayal. No, I had to be smarter. So I slipped back into my room, my pulse still racing, my mind sharper than it had been in years. I pulled open the drawer of my nightstand, reached for the worn envelope I had kept safe for decades. Inside was the deed, my name, my wife's name, no one else's. The proof that despite their schemes, despite their arrogance, the house was still mine. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the faded ink, tracing the signatures with my trembling finger. They had forgotten this. They had overlooked the very foundation of their plan. They thought I was weak, blind, ready to sign anything to keep the peace. They thought I was too old to fight back, but they were wrong. I whispered into the silence, almost as if speaking to my wife's memory. They forgot. The deed is still mine. The next morning I acted as though nothing had happened. I joined them at breakfast, nodded politely when my son-in-law launched into yet another monologue about rising costs, feigned absent-mindedness. When my daughter hinted that I should start trusting them with paperwork, they thought they were playing me, but in truth the game had already shifted. I wasn't the pawn anymore. I was the player. Each night after they went to bed, I sat at the small desk in my cramped downstairs room, making notes, organizing files, preparing myself. I even called an old friend of mine, a lawyer, who had handled the estate when my wife passed. His voice was calm, steady, exactly what I needed. "Frank," he said, "you're not crazy. I've seen this before. Kids' in-laws, they think they're entitled. But the law is on your side. The house is yours. Don't sign a damn thing. And when the time comes, we'll make sure they regret underestimating you." For the first time in months, I slept soundly that night. Because now I had a plan. But still, the wound burned. Every time my daughter smiled at me, every time she called me dad, in that sweet tone she used to manipulate me, I felt the betrayal sink deeper. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that maybe I had misheard, that maybe she was being pressured by him. But the words echoed in my head. "He trusts me. He'll sign if I ask him to." That wasn't pressure, that was choice. Her choice. So, I tell you now, betrayal rarely arrives like a thunderclap. It seeps in quietly disguised as love, wrapped in trust, until one night you hear the truth with your own ears and realize you've been living beside strangers. And I'll ask you this, if you uncovered a secret plan designed to strip you of everything you built, would you confront it head on? Or would you, like me, hide the knowledge in your heart, waiting for the right moment to strike back? Comment. Okay, if you believe silence can be the sharpest weapon. Once the mask had slipped, once I knew their plan, everything I saw in the house became evidence. Every word they spoke, every look they shared, every whispered conversation that trailed off when I entered the room, it was all part of the plot. Before I had ignored the cracks. Now I watched them widen day by day, and the sound of that crumbling wall grew louder in my mind. Tom started pushing harder, his spreadsheets growing more detailed, his arguments more aggressive. He sat at the table one evening, with a stack of papers tapping his pen against the columns, like he was teaching a lecture. "Frank, we need to face reality. Taxes are going up. Insurance premiums are brutal. This house is a burden, and you need to contribute. We're not asking for much, $2,000 a month. It's fair." I stared at him, my jaw tight, my heart steady. Fair. The word had lost all meaning. It was no longer about costs or bills. It was about control, about writing me out of my own story. My daughter, standing by his side, nodded with that brittle expression on her face, her eyes hard where they once were, soft. "Dad, it's time. You can't expect us to carry everything." I wanted to laugh. Carry everything. They had no idea what carrying really meant. Carrying was waking up before dawn and working 2 jobs so your child could have braces. Carrying was watching your wife skip new clothes so your daughter could have a prom dress. Carrying was staying up through the night, fixing a leaky roof with your own 2 hands because you couldn't afford a contractor. They didn't carry, they consumed, and now they wanted more. But I stayed silent. I had already chosen my battlefield, and it wasn't this table. Not yet. Behind the scenes, I began moving. I contacted my lawyer again, arranging quiet meetings in an office far from their eyes. We went over the deed, the will, the trust papers my wife and I had signed years ago. Every I was dotted, every T crossed. The house was mine, legally unshakable. But legal right wasn't enough. I had to prepare for the war of perception, the lies they would spread, the manipulation they would wield when the truth finally cornered them. Meanwhile, their campaign of attrition escalated. They started cutting me out of small decisions. Groceries arrived without my input, my old favorite foods disappearing from the pantry. My tools from the garage were quietly boxed up, pushed into a corner, as though my skills, my history were clutter to be discarded. They painted over walls without asking erasing color choices my wife and I had made together. Each stroke of gray paint was another attempt to scrub me out of the home I built. And then came the real blow. One Saturday morning, I was sitting on the porch nursing a cup of coffee when Alexis pulled up to the curb. A man in a suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. He walked up to the front door like he belonged there. My stomach dropped. I didn't have to ask who he was. An appraiser? I watched from the shadows as Tom greeted him with the slick smile of a man who thinks he's already won. They walked around the yard, gesturing at the roofline, measuring the property like it was a prize carcass they were carving up. My daughter stood by, arms folded, not saying much, but not stopping him either. For half an hour they toured the grounds, and every second was another dagger in my chest. They hadn't even bothered to hide it. They were already making moves to sell, to erase me completely. That night, I confronted my daughter, gently testing the waters. "Jess," I said, keeping my voice soft, "why was there a man here today? Someone with a clipboard." Her eyes flickered just for a moment before she covered it with a sweet smile. "Oh, Dad, don't worry. Tom's just looking into some property values. Nothing serious." Nothing serious. She was lying to my face. And the worst part? She was using the same tone she used when she was 16 and trying to hide a broken vase. Except, this time, it wasn't a vase. It was my life. The escalation didn't stop there. They began leaving brochures on the counter, open to glossy pages of retirement communities. Just options, Dad? My daughter would say, her voice dripping with feigned concern. We just want you to be comfortable. Comfortable. In their vision, comfortable meant exile, a gilded cage where I would be tucked away forgotten, while they claimed the fortress my wife and I had built. I started to wonder if they could even hear themselves anymore. Did they not realize how transparent they had become? Or had greed deafened them completely? Meanwhile, my lawyer and I crafted a plan, a quiet sale, a transfer of ownership through trusted hands, an irrevocable trust that would lock the proceeds away from anyone but me. A fortress on paper, one even their manipulation couldn't breach. It was bold, it was final, and it was the only way. But in order to make it work, I had to endure the escalation in silence. I had to let them believe they were winning, let them push harder, let them think I was the defeated old man too tired to resist. So, I played the role. I moved slower, spoke less, sighed more often. I let Tom mistake my silence for surrender. I let Jessica confuse my compliance with weakness. Every time she looked at me with that mix of pity and impatience, I reminded myself, let her think she's in control. The quieter I was, the louder the fall would be when the truth finally crashed down. Still, the nights were the hardest. I lay awake in that cramped room downstairs, staring at the ceiling, hearing the muffled laughter above me. Every creak of the floorboards was another reminder that they were sleeping in the bed my wife and I once shared, living a life built on my sweat plotting to erase me from it. The rage burned hot in my chest, but beneath it was something colder, something steadier. The resolve of a man who had been underestimated his whole life and was about to prove them all wrong. And maybe that's what betrayal really does. It doesn't just hurt, it sharpens. It strips away illusions, hardens your spine, steels your will. Betrayal is the forge, and I was coming out of it tempered like steel. So, when Tom leaned across the table one evening and said, "Frank, you can't keep dragging this out. Either pay rent or find somewhere else to live," I just nodded slowly, my face blank. "You're right," I said, and his smirk widened. But inside, I was already miles ahead of him, already laying the final stones of the trap he would walk into. Because the escalation wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. And I'll ask you now, if you were in my shoes, would you keep fighting at the table where they control the rules? Or would you like me step back, build your own battlefield, and wait for them to stumble into it? Blind comment. Yes. If you believe sometimes silence is the deadliest strategy, the day of the reckoning didn't arrive with thunder or lightning. It came quietly wrapped in the dull gray light of a Tuesday morning, the kind of day you would forget if it weren't for the storm that broke inside those courthouse walls. They had finally pushed me to the edge, and the law, cold, steady, impartial, was the weapon I had chosen. It began when Tom shoved another stack of papers in front of me at breakfast. He slid them across the table with that same patronizing smile, the one that said he thought he had me cornered. "Just sign, Frank. It's a refinancing deal, standard stuff. It'll make everything easier for all of us." I looked down at the papers, dense legal language numbers and columns, jargon designed to confuse. But I had already shown them to my lawyer. I knew exactly what it was. A transfer of ownership. A death sentence for my dignity. I lifted my eyes, slowly meeting his, and said nothing. My silence seemed to please him. He thought he had broken me. He thought the old man was finally giving in. 2 days later, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer by my side. The air inside smelled like paper and dust and finality. My daughter and her husband were already there, sitting on the other side of the room, their heads bent together, as if they were plotting even in those last minutes. She wouldn't look at me. He did, though. His grin was sharp, cruel. The judge entered and we all rose. The case was called. Miller versus Miller, the clerk announced, the words echoing in my skull like a hammer. My own name divided, torn in half. Their lawyer stood first, a slick man in a tailored suit, his voice smooth as oil. He painted me as an old man past his prime, incapable of managing property, a burden on my daughter and her husband. He spoke of fairness, of shared responsibility, of my supposed neglect. I sat still, my hands folded, my face calm. But inside, my blood boiled with every lie he uttered. Then my daughter took the stand. My daughter? The girl I had once carried on my shoulders so she could see the fireworks better on the 4th of July. She sat there, eyes downcast, voice trembling just enough to seem convincing. "My father has changed," she said softly. "He doesn't understand the financial strain we're under. We've been supporting him for months. We only asked for a small contribution, but he refuses. We can't keep living like this." I wanted to stand up to shout, to remind her of the nights I worked double shifts of the tuition checks I wrote, with calloused hands of the promises I kept when her mother died. But I didn't. Not yet. Because the truth was waiting. And the truth is stronger when it's revealed at the breaking point. Finally, it was my turn. My lawyer called me to the stand. I rose slowly, every eye in the courtroom, on me every step echoing like a drumbeat of war. I sat down, placed my hands on the rail, and looked straight at my daughter. For the first time in months, she met my gaze. Her eyes wavered. "Mr. Miller," the judge said, "do you have anything to present to this court?" I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers brushing against the envelope I had carried for decades, the one that had never left my side since that night in the garage. I pulled it out, placed it on the table, and slid it toward the clerk. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, resonant, carrying every ounce of my resolve. "I have the deed." The clerk opened the envelope, unfolding the yellowed paper, the signatures still bold, the ink still alive with history. My name, my wife's name, the only names that mattered. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading carefully. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Then he spoke. "According to this document, the property in question is solely owned by Mr. Frank Miller. There is no record of transfer, refinancing, or shared ownership. This house legally belongs to him." The words landed like thunder. Tom's smug grin vanished, his face draining of color. My daughter's lips parted, a soft gasp escaping before she could stop it. Their lawyer stammered, tried to argue, but the judge raised a hand. "The law is clear. The house is his. Case dismissed." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the chamber, sharp and final. For a moment, the world went silent. I sat there, breathing deeply, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. Then I turned to look at them. My daughter's eyes were wet, her face pale. Tom glared at me with the rage of a man who had lost not just a battle, but the war he thought he had already won. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but I only heard the sound of my own footsteps as I walked toward them. I stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the cracks in their armor, close enough to let them hear every word. "This was never about money," I said quietly but firmly, my voice cutting through the noise. "It was about respect, and you forgot who taught you the meaning of that word." My daughter's tears spilled, then rolling down her cheeks, her hands trembling in her lap. Tom muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care. They were finished. Their game was over. The bailiff called for order. The judge left the bench. The case was done. But for me, the moment stretched on, carved into eternity. Because this wasn't just a legal victory. It was the reclaiming of my dignity, the restoration of a promise I had made to the woman I loved more than life itself. When I walked out of that courthouse, the sunlight felt different on my face, lighter, warmer. For the first time in years, I felt free. But freedom has a cost. As we stepped onto the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Miller, how does it feel to win against your own daughter?" one of them shouted. I paused, looking into the sea of lenses, then back at my daughter and her husband, standing behind me, broken, defeated. "It doesn't feel like a win," I said softly. "It feels like survival. They tried to erase me. Instead, they erased themselves." And with that, I turned away. But the confrontation didn't end at the courthouse. That evening, my daughter called me. Her voice was hoarse, trembling. "Dad, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought we needed the money. I thought Tom knew best. Please, don't hate me." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Her words stabbed deeper than any courtroom battle, because beneath the greed, beneath the betrayal, she was still my little girl, lost and misguided. "I don't hate you," I whispered, "but I can't trust you, and trust once broken is harder to rebuild than any house." She sobbed, then hung up. I sat alone in the silence, staring at the walls of the home I had defended, the home that had survived the siege. And I realized that victory doesn't always taste sweet. Sometimes it's bitter. Sometimes it leaves scars that will never fully heal. But it was mine. It was justice. So I ask you, when the truth is finally revealed, when the mask is torn away and the world sees betrayal for what it is, do you feel triumph, or do you, like me, feel the hollow ache of a battle that never should have been fought at all. Comment. Yes, if you believe justice is worth the pain it takes to claim it. After the courthouse, after the gavel fell and the whispers faded, I returned to the house with the deed in my pocket and silence in my chest. You might think victory brings celebration, that I would unlock the front door, step inside, and feel a rush of triumph. But triumph is not what waited for me. What waited was emptiness. The same rooms I had fought so hard to protect now felt like tombs filled with ghosts of arguments and betrayal. Every wall carried the echo of words I wished I could forget, my daughter's voice, telling me I no longer belonged, my son-in-law's smug tone as he planned to erase me. I had won, yes. The law was on my side. But the home itself no longer felt like a home. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table my wife and I had eaten at every day for 30 years, and I stared at the wood grain until my vision blurred. I remembered her last words, her final request. Promise me you'll keep this house. I had kept that promise. I had defended it against greed and betrayal. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized keeping the house and keeping my dignity were not the same thing. A house is brick and mortar. Dignity is flesh and bone. And dignity cannot live in a place poisoned by betrayal. So I made my choice. I called my lawyer the next morning and gave him instructions. Within weeks, the papers were signed, the contracts sealed. I sold the house, but not to them. Never to them. I sold it to a trust I created in my wife's name, a foundation to fund scholarships for students who had lost a parent, so that no child would ever have to face the kind of loss my daughter and I once shared. The proceeds, every cent, were locked into that foundation, untouchable by greedy hands. The house that had once been our fortress would now become a lifeline for others, a legacy far greater than any deed could hold. When the realtor's sign went up in the front yard, Tom stormed into the house, his face red with rage. "You can't do this," he hissed. "You're throwing everything away." I looked him in the eye, calm as stone. "No, Tom, I'm giving it away. There's a difference. You wanted the bricks. I wanted the dignity. And dignity isn't for sale." Jessica stood behind him, tears streaking her face. For a moment, I almost reached out, almost let the father in me break through the wall I had built. But then I remembered the voice in the garage, the plan she had agreed to, the words that had cut me deepest. He trusts me. He'll sign if I ask him to. Trust once broken does not return so easily. I let the silence stand between us, heavier than any goodbye. When I walked away from that house for the last time, I carried nothing but a suitcase and the memory of a promise fulfilled. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, and I whispered to my wife's memory, I kept it safe, love. I kept it until it was time to let it go. Now I live in a smaller place, simpler, quieter. The walls don't carry echoes of betrayal. The air is lighter. Sometimes in the evenings I sit on the porch and listen to the wind, and I wonder if my daughter ever regrets what she did. I wonder if she remembers the little girl who once called this house a castle, and if she realizes that, in trying to claim it, she destroyed it. I don't know if she will ever call me again. I don't know if the wound between us will ever heal, but I do know this. I did not let betrayal define me. I did not let greed win. I walked away with my dignity intact, and in the end, that is worth more than any property, any inheritance, any fleeting comfort. So, if you've listened to my story, if you followed me through the storm, I want to ask you one last question. What would you have done? Would you have clung to the house, even if it meant living in the shadows of betrayal? Or would you like me have chosen to walk away carrying nothing but the weight of your own unbroken pride? Comment 1. If you believe dignity is worth more than bricks and walls. Like this, if you know respect must be earned, not inherited. Because in the end, a house can be stolen, sold, or burned to the ground. But dignity is the one thing that can only be taken if you give it away. And I refused.